When historians describe Iowa in 1856, they almost always focus on what was visible above ground. Westward expansion was accelerating. New settlements were forming along the frontier. Pioneer communities were raising their first permanent buildings from wood, brick, and stone. Iowa had only been a state for 10 years, and its story, at least officially, was just beginning, but that familiar narrative ignores what was happening beneath the soil, the real story one, that barely survived beyond a single newspaper. Article didn't begin with conquest or settlement. It began with a routine construction order. Workmen were instructed to excavate a cellar for a new building commissioned by Governor James W. Grimes at the corner of Main and Valley Streets. The task was simple: dig down, prepare the foundation, and move on. Then the shovels hit something solid, not bedrock, not a tree root, something shaped, something constructed. As the crew broke through the Iowa prairie soil, they exposed a layer that hadn't seen daylight in living memory and at a depth that made no sense for any known natural formation. What emerged was an arched underground vault, roughly 10 feet square, sealed and intact. It shouldn't have been there. Its construction immediately raised questions. This was not a crude pit or a collapsed root cellar. The vault was engineered. Its walls were measured at approximately 14 inches thick and laid with cement or some other binding material that workers later described as unusually durable, almost indestructible. The arched ceiling alone suggested knowledge of load distribution and structural design far beyond what frontier builders were using in 1856. Iowa. And then they looked inside. The local newspaper reported the discovery only once in a brief matter-of-fact tone. No sensational language, no dramatic speculation. Just a simple account of what the workmen found. 8 human skeletons, laid out deliberately, preserved in a good state, and described as being of gigantic proportions, each measuring approximately 8 to 10 feet in length. The article referred to them plainly as the largest remains ever found. There was no attempt to explain them, no effort to soften the implication. Then something strange happened. The story vanished. There were no follow-up articles. No official investigation. No scientists summoned from the East. No detailed measurements, no sketches. No preserved photographs when such documentation later became common. The discovery simply slipped into silence, as if it had never occurred at all. Years later, when the incident was mentioned at all, the explanation was dismissive. A misidentification, exaggeration, perhaps Native American remains, perhaps animal bones confused for human. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth remembering, but the original 1856 account still preserved in a small number of archives tells a different story. It describes a structure that did not match pioneer construction methods, and remains that did not match any known population associated with Iowa's history. A vault built to endure. Skeletons arranged with care. A burial that implied intention, planning, and cultural meaning. This was not something hastily buried. This was something deliberately preserved. And if that's true, the question isn't why the discovery was strange. The question is why it disappeared so completely. By the time the excavation crew fully exposed the structure beneath Main and Valley Streets, it was clear they were not dealing with an ordinary burial. This wasn't a shallow grave accidentally unearthed by frontier laborers. What lay beneath the prairie was architecture deliberate, engineered, and built to last. The first detail that unsettled the workers was the arch. Arch construction is not intuitive. It requires precise measurement, careful placement of stone or brick, and an understanding of how weight distributes downward and outward. It is a technique used when a builder expects pressure from above centuries of soil, frost, and time. You don't use an arch for convenience. You use it for permanence. Yet here it was, buried beneath land that official history says had never supported permanent settlements before. European arrival, then there were the walls. 14 inches thick, according to the newspaper account. That is far beyond what would be required for a simple burial vault. That kind of thickness is defensive. It is what you build when you intend to protect what's inside from collapse, moisture, and decay. The workmen remarked that the mortar binding the walls showed no signs of crumbling or weakness. Decades, possibly centuries underground, had not degraded it. Frontier Iowa did not have this technology. There are no records of settlers in the region producing cement-like mortar of such durability in the mid-1800s, and certainly no reason for them to bury a structure like this beneath untouched prairie. The materials and methods didn't match pioneer construction, military engineering, or any known early territorial infrastructure. As the workers entered the chamber, the scale became undeniable. The vault measured roughly 10 feet square and extended approximately 6 feet from the base of the arch. Inside, 8 skeletons were arranged carefully, not scattered or piled. This was not the aftermath of violence, disease, or disaster. It was a formal burial, conducted by people who expected this chamber to endure, and then there were the remains themselves. Each skeleton was described as complete, intact, and in good condition. The lengths were estimated between 8 and 10 feet. That detail matters. Isolated cases of gigantism exist, but they leave unmistakable skeletal markers, deformed joints, disproportionate limbs, stress fractures. The newspaper made no mention of abnormalities. Instead, it treated the size as the defining characteristic, not a medical curiosity. 8 individuals, all unusually large, all buried together. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a group. Among the workers, explanations were quietly discussed. Perhaps it was a storage vault from some forgotten settlement. Perhaps it belonged to an earlier culture that had passed through the region. But none of those theories answered the central problem. Why build something so permanent, so carefully engineered for bodies of such extraordinary size? Iowa in 1856 was still being mapped. Roads were rough. Towns were sparse. Yet beneath that developing landscape lay evidence of a society that understood advanced construction techniques and invested enormous effort into how their dead were preserved. The newspaper report offered no conclusions, only observations. It did not claim giants from myth or lost races from legend. It simply stated what was found. And in doing so, it left behind a record that refuses to fit neatly into the accepted story of the American frontier. What troubled the workers most was not just the size of the skeletons, but the intention behind the burial. Someone had cared enough to build this chamber. Someone had the knowledge to design it. Someone expected it to last. And that raises a far more uncomfortable question than the size of the remains. Who were they building it for? Under normal circumstances, a discovery like the one beneath Governor Grimes's construction site should have triggered a chain reaction. News should have spread beyond a single local paper. Scholars from Eastern universities should have requested access. Measurements should have been taken, drawings made, specimens preserved. Even by mid-19th century standards, 8 unusually large human skeletons in a purpose-built underground vault would have been impossible to ignore, but none of that happened. Instead, the story did something unnatural. It didn't grow, it shrank. After the initial newspaper mention, there were no follow-ups, no editorials, no letters debating what the discovery meant, no record of scientific curiosity. The vault was reportedly filled back in, and construction continued as if nothing extraordinary had been found beneath the site. Officially, when explanations appeared years later, they were vague and dismissive. The remains were described as a misidentification, perhaps Native American burials, perhaps exaggerated frontier storytelling, perhaps animal bones confused for human skeletons. The incident was quietly categorized as a curiosity, not evidence, yet that dismissal collapses under closer inspection. This wasn't a single skeleton discovered by one unreliable witness. It was 8 skeletons observed by multiple workmen, described in specific measurements and reported confidently enough for publication. The article made no attempt to sensationalize the find, which makes its matter-of-fact tone even more significant. Frontier newspapers were not shy about exaggeration when it suited them. If anything, this report sounds restrained. Then there's the issue of preservation. The skeletons were described as being in good condition. That suggests the vault did exactly what it was designed to do, protect its contents from moisture, animals, and decay. Whatever civilization built it understood long-term preservation. And yet, no institution ever claimed responsibility for studying or storing the remains. By the late 1800s, American museums and universities were aggressively collecting artifacts. Archaeological expeditions were being funded. The Smithsonian institution was receiving shipments of bones, tools, and relics from across the continent. But there is no public record of the Iowa skeletons ever arriving at any major institution. They simply vanish. Some argue this can be explained by frontier practicality. Iowa in 1856 had no established archaeological framework. Construction delays were expensive. The governor needed his building. Perhaps the workers reburied the remains and moved on. But that explanation fails to address what happened afterward. Why did no later archaeologists return to the site? Why was no excavation conducted once archaeology became a formal discipline? Why did the original account remain a footnote rather than a subject of study? The silence begins to look less like neglect and more like avoidance. What makes the Iowa case even more unsettling is that it wasn't unique. Throughout the 19th century, similar reports appeared in local newspapers across the United States, Wisconsin, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, again and again. Stories described the opening of burial mounds or underground chambers revealing skeletons measuring 7, 8, even 9 feet in length. Many accounts included descriptions of artifacts, copper ornaments, carefully arranged graves, and evidence of organized burial practices, and again, the pattern repeated. Brief public attention, then silence. The remains disappeared. The mounds were destroyed by farming or development. The evidence was lost before systematic study could occur. When these discoveries are mapped, they form clusters along river valleys and major waterways locations that suggest long-term habitation, not isolated anomalies. These were not random finds. They point to something widespread, something structured, something that once existed on a scale larger than our current historical models allow. And that is precisely why the Iowa discovery matters so much, because it fits the pattern perfectly. By the late 1800s, reports of unusually large human remains were no longer rare. They were common enough to form a pattern, one that stretched across decades and across states. And yet, despite their frequency, they never made it into official history. In Wisconsin in 1891, investigators reportedly opened burial mounds containing skeletons of extraordinary size. According to newspaper accounts, the remains were carefully removed and sent to Washington for further study. After that, the trail ends. The skeletons were never publicly displayed. No academic papers followed. No museum exhibits referenced them. They entered a bureaucratic void from which nothing emerged. Ohio tells a similar story. Throughout the 19th century, local papers documented the opening of ancient mounds that revealed skeletons measuring 7 to 9 feet in length. These discoveries were often accompanied by detailed descriptions of artifacts, copper tools, ornaments, and burial arrangements that implied social structure and ritual significance. And yet, within months, the finds vanished from public discussion. Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, again and again. The same sequence unfolds: discovery, brief attention, institutional silence. The standard explanation has always been convenient: exaggeration, hoaxes, or misidentified animal bones, mastodons mistaken for men, frontier imagination filling in the gaps. But that explanation strains under the weight of repetition. It requires us to believe that hundreds of independent witnesses across multiple states, over many decades, all made the same mistake. Or worse, that they all participated in the same fabrication. It also requires us to ignore the engineering evidence. The Iowa vault was not an earthen mound shaped by erosion or ritual piling. It was constructed. Its arched ceiling, thick walls, and durable mortar point to knowledge of structural mechanics and material science. Similar construction details appear in other reported sites: stone-lined chambers, carefully laid floors, reinforced walls. These are not the features of temporary camps or seasonal burial practices. They suggest permanence. And that permanence creates a direct conflict with the accepted narrative of North American prehistory. According to conventional models, pre-contact societies in the Midwest were primarily nomadic or semi-sedentary, building nothing meant to endure for centuries. Monumental architecture was not supposed to exist here. Permanent underground vaults were not supposed to be part of the landscape. Yet the evidence keeps pointing in that direction. When institutions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began formalizing archaeology, they also solidified a story. Native Americans arrived via the Bering Land Bridge, developed independently, and did not construct durable stone architecture before European contact. Any evidence that challenged this framework became problematic. Giant skeletons suggested a population that did not fit known physical norms. Engineered burial chambers suggested technological capabilities that exceeded accepted timelines. Artifacts implied social organization and cultural complexity that contradicted prevailing assumptions. So what happened to that evidence? It wasn't smashed or publicly destroyed. That would have drawn attention. Instead, it was quietly set aside, archived without fanfare, stored without cataloging, classified as anomalous and therefore unimportant. Over time, it became inaccessible not through conspiracy, but through institutional inertia. This is what passive erasure looks like. Not a secret meeting, not an order to suppress, but a series of decisions about what is worth studying and what can be safely ignored. Questions that don't fit are simply not asked. Evidence that complicates the narrative is allowed to disappear into storage rooms, mislabeled boxes, or forgotten collections. The Iowa giants weren't erased in a single act. They were forgotten on purpose. When the Iowa discovery is examined on its own without later dismissals or convenient explanations, a consistent picture emerges. The evidence does not point to a hoax, a misunderstanding, or an isolated anomaly. It points to something far more difficult to accept. The vault beneath the Iowa prairie demonstrated deliberate engineering. The arched ceiling required knowledge of force distribution. The 14-inch thick walls suggested experience with load-bearing construction. The mortar, described as nearly indestructible, implied a level of material understanding that frontier builders simply did not possess. This was not improvised. It was planned. The burial itself tells an equally important story. 8 individuals were placed carefully inside the chamber. The remains were complete, preserved, and arranged with intention. This was not a mass grave created in panic. It was a formal burial carried out by a society with social structure, ritual practices, and the resources to invest in permanence. And then there is the issue of scale. If newspaper measurements were even approximately accurate. The skeletons range from 8 to 10 feet in length. This was not a single case of abnormal growth. It was a group, a population segment large enough to justify a specialized burial structure built to accommodate bodies far larger than those of modern humans. That alone challenges conventional explanations. Gigantism does not produce communities of uniformly tall individuals. It produces rare cases marked by skeletal deformities and shortened lifespans. The Iowa remains were described as well-formed and well-preserved, suggesting normal proportions, just on a much larger scale. So what happened next? The vault was filled in. Governor Grimes's building went up. The skeletons vanished from public record. No one in a position of authority created a clear chain of custody. No one documented where the remains went. No excavation was revisited later. The site was built over, paved, and forgotten. This wasn't malice. It was convenience. The frontier economy had no room for delays. Archaeology as a discipline barely existed. And once a narrative took hold that such discoveries were exaggerations or mistakes, there was no incentive to reopen old questions. Silence became easier than revision, but silence has consequences, because when discoveries like the Iowa Vault are viewed alongside hundreds of similar reports from the 1800s. A disturbing possibility takes shape. What if North America was once home to a population we no longer acknowledge? What if the mounds scattered across the Midwest are not simple burial hills, but the remnants of architectural complexes dismantled by time, agriculture, and expansion? What if an entire chapter of human history was erased not through force but through neglect? The evidence exists, but in fragments. Newspaper articles that were never followed up. Museum collections that were never cataloged. Sites that were destroyed before systematic study could begin. The truth, whatever it is, survives only in gaps, silences, and unanswered questions. For a brief moment in 1856, the ground beneath Iowa opened and revealed something out of place. 8 enormous skeletons. A vault that should not exist. Engineering knowledge that did not belong in the accepted timeline, then it was covered up again. The Iowa giants were not just a curiosity. They were a warning one that suggests our understanding of the past may be far less complete than we assume. And if something like this could lie hidden beneath a single construction site, undiscovered until an accidental dig, then the real question isn't whether the story is true, it's how much more is still buried beneath the farmlands of America, waiting to be uncovered or quietly forgotten once again.